Smoke filled the air, thick and choking, as screams and shouts echoed through the busy neighborhood. Flames climbed high from the second-floor window of an old brick building, a young mother shrieking frantically at the street below, "My baby! My baby's in there!" People were already gathering on the street, pointing and gasping, helpless to do anything but watch the blaze grow. Fire trucks were on the way, but the smoke was getting darker, and every second counted. Suddenly, a tall man rushed forward from the crowd, his face serious but determined. His name was Marcus, a soft-spoken but strong man who worked in a nearby grocery store. Without a second thought, he bolted towards the building, pushing past the small crowd gathering near the doorway. He took a deep breath and disappeared into the thick smoke. Inside, the heat was intense. Marcus could feel it pressing against his skin, making it hard to breathe. He called out, "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" But he could only hear the crackling flames and the distant sound of a baby's cry. Step by step, he made his way up the narrow staircase, feeling his way through the thick, blinding smoke. The baby's cries grew louder, coming from a bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was closed, and Marcus could feel the heat seeping through the door's edges, but he wasn't about to give up. He wrapped his jacket around his hand and kicked the door open. There, lying in a crib with red cheeks and tear-stained eyes, was a baby no older than a year. Marcus quickly scooped the baby up, shielding the little one with his body as he turned back to the hallway. He knew he didn't have much time. Outside, the crowd gasped as they saw Marcus reappear, holding the baby close. He stumbled down the stairs and finally emerged, coughing and blinking through the thick smoke. The crowd burst into cheers, grateful and relieved that the baby was safe. But just as Marcus tried to catch his breath, he noticed a woman with an icy stare marching toward him. Her face was twisted with anger and shock. She snatched the baby from his arms, glaring at him. "Who gave you the right to touch my child?" she hissed, her voice cold and sharp. Marcus, still panting from the rescue, looked at her confused. He had expected gratitude, but instead, he felt her resentment. He tried to explain, I just wanted to help." But she only glared harder, her eyes flashing with something Marcus recognized all too well. The crowd had quieted down, their excitement turning to unease as they watched the woman's unexpected reaction. Marcus glanced at the people around him, his heart sinking as he saw the tension in their faces. Was he in trouble? The woman's voice cut through the silence as she held the baby close to her chest. "Don't you ever come near my family again," she spat, her voice dripping with disgust. She looked around at the crowd, as if expecting them to join her in her fury, but everyone seemed stunned, unsure of what to make of the scene. A man from the crowd finally stepped forward. "Ma'am, this man just saved your child. You should be thanking him." But the woman's expression didn't soften. She pulled the baby tighter, refusing to even look at Marcus. "People like him have no business touching my baby," she snapped, her words heavy with a clear meaning that made everyone feel uncomfortable. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He had rushed into a burning building, risked his own life to save this baby, and yet here he was, being treated like he had done something wrong. He wanted to defend himself, to explain, but the words just wouldn't come out. He felt the weight of the woman's anger pressing on him like a physical force. Just then, a fire truck pulled up and firefighters began to pour out, ready to put out the blaze. The woman quickly turned her attention to them, putting on a worried expression. "Please, my apartment, can you save it?" she asked, her tone softening for the first time since she'd appeared. One of the firefighters nodded. "We'll do our best, ma'am." He looked at Marcus, who was still standing there frozen. "Sir, are you okay? You look like you breathed in a lot of smoke." Marcus managed to nod. "Yeah, I'll be fine." But inside, he didn't feel fine at all. His chest felt tight, and not just from the smoke. He looked at the baby, who was now calm in the woman's arms, and then back at her cold glare. He wanted to say something, to make her see him as more than just whatever she thought he was. As Marcus turned to walk away, a young girl in the crowd suddenly called out, "Wait, thank you, mister, you saved that baby." The crowd began to clap again, and a few people even came forward, patting him on the back and shaking his hand. But Marcus barely heard them. His mind was racing with thoughts, each one more upsetting than the last. Why did this happen? Why would anyone react like that? He walked away from the crowd, trying to disappear down a side street where he could be alone with his thoughts. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just walking away from the fire scene. He was walking away from something bigger, something he didn't fully understand yet. Later that evening, as Marcus sat alone in his small apartment, the scene replayed over and over in his mind. He had grown up in this neighborhood, knew many of the people here, but he'd never felt so out of place, so unwelcome. He thought about the baby's face, the tiny hands gripping onto his jacket as he carried her through the smoke. A part of him was proud of what he'd done, but another part couldn't ignore the woman's cold, hateful stare. Just then, his phone rang, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was his friend David, a fellow grocery store worker who had been there when the fire broke out. "Hey man," David said, his voice warm and familiar. "I saw what happened. You're a hero, Marcus. Don't let that woman get to you." Marcus sighed. "Thanks, David. I don't know, though. The way she looked at me, I just don't get it." David paused for a moment. "Some people are just like that, man. They can't see past what they think they know about someone. But that's their problem, not yours. You did a brave thing today." "Yeah, I guess," Marcus replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "I just didn't expect it to end like that. You think she'll get over it?" "Who cares what she thinks?" David replied, his tone serious now. "Look, you saved that baby's life, and no one can take that away from you. Don't let her poison your good deed." Marcus wanted to believe David, but deep down, he knew he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. A few days later, Marcus was back at the grocery store, stocking shelves when he heard the familiar chime of the doorbell. Looking up, he froze. The woman from the fire had just walked in, her eyes immediately scanning the store. Marcus swallowed hard, bracing himself. Why was she here? Had she come to thank him, or was she still holding on to her anger? As she walked toward him, Marcus noticed something strange. She wasn't alone. There was a man with her, someone tall and stern-looking, who carried an expression of disapproval. Marcus felt a wave of dread wash over him as the two of them stopped in front of him. The woman's expression hadn't softened at all. In fact, if anything, she looked angrier than ever. "You," she said, her voice low but sharp, "need to stay away from my family. We don't need people like you in our lives." Marcus blinked, struggling to keep his composure. He had no idea what to say. The man beside her nodded, his face hard. "You overstepped, buddy. You need to know your place." The few customers in the store had stopped shopping, their eyes wide as they watched the confrontation unfold. Marcus felt his hands clench, but he kept his voice steady, determined not to let his anger show. "With all due respect," he said calmly, "your baby was in danger. I just did what anyone else would have done." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Not anyone else. We didn't ask for your help." Marcus could feel the eyes of everyone in the store on him. He knew he could try to defend himself, but something told him that nothing he said would change their minds. He thought back to the smoke-filled room, to the baby's cries, to the fear in his own heart as he braved the fire. It was still so vivid, yet somehow, here he was, being told he was in the wrong. One of his coworkers, Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who'd been like a grandmother to Marcus, suddenly stepped forward. She put a gentle hand on his shoulder and looked at the couple with a fierce gaze. "Now, wait a minute. This young man saved a life. Your baby's life, no less, and all you can do is criticize him." Her voice, though soft, had an edge that commanded respect. The man beside the woman scoffed. "We don't need a lecture from you, ma'am. We're just here to make sure he understands his place." But Mrs. Peterson wasn't having any of it. "His place," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "His place was in that burning building, doing something neither of you had the courage to do. He risked his life for your child." The woman scowled and took a step back, clearly not expecting anyone to stand up to her. She clutched her bag tighter, looking like she might say something. But then the store manager, Mr. Andrews, stepped forward. He had overheard everything, and his face was red with anger. "Look, folks," Mr. Andrews began, his voice steady but firm, "if you came in here to disrespect one of my best employees, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man shook his head and muttered, "Unbelievable," before turning toward the door. The woman gave Marcus one last icy glare before following him out. As the door shut behind them, a wave of relief washed over Marcus, though he could still feel the tension clinging to him. The customers and his coworkers all started murmuring, some offering him words of support, others shaking their heads at the couple's behavior. Mrs. Peterson patted his arm reassuringly. "Don't you let them get you down, Marcus. You did a brave thing. We're all proud of you." Marcus managed a small smile, though the ache in his chest hadn't completely faded. He appreciated everyone's kindness, but he knew that the couple's words would linger in his mind long after this moment had passed. Later that evening, as Marcus walked home from the store, he couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. He had tried to do the right thing, but it had only led to trouble. He began to wonder if maybe he should have just stayed back, let the firefighters do their job. But deep down, he knew he would have made the same choice again if he had to. As he turned the corner onto his street, he saw a group of teenagers gathered outside his apartment building. They were talking excitedly, pointing at something in the distance. Marcus frowned, wondering what was going on. "Hey Marcus," one of the teens called out when they noticed him. "Did you see? The story about the fire made it into the paper. You're famous, man." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He hadn't expected any publicity from the rescue, let alone a newspaper article. "Really?" he asked, feeling a mix of surprise and unease. The teen held up his phone, showing Marcus the online article. Sure enough, there was a picture of the burning building, with a headline that read, "Local hero saves baby from fire. Faces unexpected reaction from child's family." The article didn't mention the woman's name, but it described her reaction in enough detail that anyone from the neighborhood could probably guess who she was. Marcus sighed, feeling the weight of it all. He had wanted to help, not become the center of attention, or worse, a subject of controversy. What if this article only made things harder for him? Just as he was about to head inside, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from David, his friend from work. "Hey man, did you see the news? Proud of you. Also, heads up. Heard some people in the neighborhood are talking about it." Marcus paused, his fingers hovering over the screen as he thought about what to reply. The whole neighborhood talking about him. This was turning into more than he'd bargained for. He typed back, "Thanks, man. Not sure how I feel about all this, though." David responded almost immediately. "I get it, but listen. You did something incredible. Don't let one person's opinion make you doubt that. People are starting to see what you're made of." Marcus appreciated the support, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get more complicated. He didn't want to be known as a hero, but somehow he had ended up with a reputation he hadn't asked for. And now, with the whole neighborhood talking, he knew it was only a matter of time before he'd have to face the woman and her family again. The next morning, Marcus tried to go about his day as usual, hoping that things would calm down. But as he stepped outside his apartment building, he noticed a familiar figure waiting near the entrance. It was the same man who had accompanied the woman at the grocery store. Marcus felt his heart rate pick up, and he considered turning back inside, but before he could, the man called out to him. "Hey," the man said, his voice carrying a mix of anger and something else, something colder. Marcus took a deep breath and walked over, preparing himself for another confrontation. The man gave him a hard look. "You got the whole neighborhood thinking you're some kind of saint, but I know what this is really about." Marcus frowned, confused. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Stay away from my family. If you don't, we're going to have a serious problem." Marcus stared at him, feeling a knot of fear form in his stomach. He hadn't expected things to go this far. He wanted to stand his ground, to tell the man that he wasn't going to be scared off, but the look in the man's eyes made him hesitate. Before Marcus could respond, the man turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, uncertain and shaken. The day had only just begun, but Marcus knew that this wasn't over. He could feel it. Something bigger was brewing, and whatever it was, he wasn't sure he was ready for it. Marcus stood outside his apartment for a few moments, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the man's words or the threat lurking in his eyes. It didn't make sense. He had saved their child, for heaven's sake. And yet here he was, facing threats, glares, and cold resentment. He tried to shake it off and head to work, but the unease stayed with him all day, hovering like a dark cloud. That evening, Marcus's phone buzzed with a call from his mother. She had seen the article and heard about the confrontation at the grocery store. "I just want you to know," she began, her voice full of warmth, "that I am so proud of you, Marcus. What you did was selfless, and nothing that woman says can change that." Marcus smiled, his mother's words soothing the frustration that had built up over the day. "Thanks, Mom. It's just, I didn't expect things to turn out like this." "People like that, they don't think beyond their own narrow views," she replied gently. "But don't let that stop you from being yourself. You know who you are, Marcus. Let that be enough." Her words gave Marcus strength. That night, he slept a little easier, thinking that maybe he could put this whole mess behind him and move on. But the next day, Marcus realized the problem wasn't going away. As he walked down the street toward work, he noticed the way people looked at him. Most of them smiled, some even thanked him, but others, neighbors he'd known for years, gave him cautious looks, as if he had done something wrong by stepping in that day. As he approached the grocery store, he noticed a flyer on the bulletin board just outside. It read, "Community Meeting. Concerns about recent events." Underneath, someone had scrawled, "Respect our families, know your place." Marcus felt his heart sink. He knew without a doubt that the meeting had something to do with him. The baby's mother and her family were stirring up talk in the community, framing his actions in the worst possible way. He had gone from a local hero to a controversial figure almost overnight. Inside the store, his manager, Mr. Andrews, pulled him aside. "Marcus," he began, his face full of concern, "I need you to be careful. This whole situation, it's starting to cause a stir. Some people aren't happy." Marcus looked down, feeling frustrated. "What did they want from me, Mr. Andrews? I did what I thought was right." Mr. Andrews sighed. "I know, and a lot of people support you. But the ones who don't, well, they're making a lot of noise. Just be careful, all right? If anything feels off, let me know." Marcus nodded, appreciating Mr. Andrews' support, but the warning only made him feel more on edge. He didn't understand how helping could turn into something so ugly. It felt like he was caught in a storm, one he hadn't asked for and couldn't control. The community meeting was scheduled for that weekend, and Marcus debated with himself whether he should attend. Part of him wanted to stand up and defend himself, to set the record straight, but another part feared that his presence would only make things worse. In the end, he decided it was better to go, if only to hear what was being said about him. On the evening of the meeting, he walked to the town hall and took a seat at the back, hoping he'd go unnoticed. But as soon as he entered, he could feel the tension in the air. Whispers spread through the crowd, and he noticed the mother and her husband sitting toward the front, shooting him a disapproving look. The meeting began, and after a few routine announcements, the topic turned to recent events. The woman's husband stood up and began to speak, his voice loud and full of accusation. "We all know why we're here," he started, looking around the room. "We have to protect our families, our values, and our way of life. Some people think they can just insert themselves into our lives without our permission. That's not okay, and we need to set boundaries." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Marcus's face grew hot as he listened, feeling each word like a punch. His hands clenched at his sides, his heart pounding as the man's words echoed the warning he'd given Marcus outside his apartment. The woman spoke next, her voice dripping with disdain. "My family was invaded by someone who didn't respect our privacy or our wishes. It's not about what he did, it's about how he did it. We don't need that kind of interference in our lives." Marcus felt a surge of anger and frustration. He had risked his life, without a second thought, to save their child, and yet here they were, twisting his actions into something malicious. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Standing up, he cleared his throat, and the crowd turned to look at him. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with suspicion. "I'd like to say something," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor he felt inside. "I understand that not everyone sees things the same way," he continued, forcing himself to stay calm. "But I didn't invade anyone's life. I just did what I thought was right. A child was in danger. I didn't think about anything else, just that I had to help." The room fell silent, but Marcus could see the disbelief in some faces, the judgment in others. The woman's husband shook his head, muttering, "There it is, always a justification." Before Marcus could respond, a voice from the crowd called out. It was Mrs. Peterson, his elderly co-worker, who had always treated him with kindness. "You people ought to be ashamed of yourselves," she said, her voice strong despite her years. "This young man did what any decent person would do. That baby is alive because of him. Why can't you see that?" A few people nodded, murmuring in agreement. But the couple at the front stayed silent, their expressions as hard as ever. The husband glanced at Marcus, his gaze as cold as steel. "Maybe we don't want help like that in our community," he said, his tone biting. Mrs. Peterson bristled, ready to argue back, but Marcus put a gentle hand on her shoulder, signaling her to let it go. He knew that no matter what he said, some people would never accept him, would always see him as an outsider. He looked around the room, catching the eyes of those who supported him, as well as those who didn't. He gave a small nod to Mrs. Peterson and quietly left the meeting, feeling the weight of their stares on his back. As he walked home that night, Marcus tried to clear his mind. The community he had grown up in now felt like a stranger to him. He thought of the baby, the precious life he had saved, and wondered if it had been worth all of this trouble. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't have changed a thing. He couldn't let their anger, their prejudice, make him regret the choice he had made. Just as he turned the corner onto his street, Marcus noticed something odd. His apartment window, usually dark this time of night, was faintly glowing. His heart pounded as he quickened his pace, wondering if he had left the light on. When he reached his apartment, he froze. Scrawled across his front door in bright red spray paint were the words, "Stay out. You're not welcome here." Marcus's heart sank as he took in the sight. This was more than just words now. This was a warning. A clear message from someone who wanted him gone. He stood there, staring at the vandalized door, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? Marcus took a shaky breath as he stared at the red spray-painted words across his door. He could feel a strange mix of anger and fear stirring inside him. This was no longer just a misunderstanding. It had turned into something ugly and personal. Someone wanted him out, and they were willing to threaten him to make it happen. After a moment, he pulled out his phone and called the building manager, Mr. Cruz, who had always been kind to him. Mr. Cruz arrived quickly, his face tightening as he took in the side of the vandalized door. "Who would do such a thing?" Mr. Cruz muttered, shaking his head. "I'll call the police. No one has the right to treat you this way, Marcus." "Thanks, Mr. Cruz," Marcus said quietly. He appreciated the support, but he couldn't help but feel uneasy. He wasn't sure if the police would be able to do much. After all, it was just spray paint, an intimidation tactic. But the message was loud and clear, and he knew things would only get worse if he ignored it. While they waited for the police, a few neighbors stepped out of their apartments to see what was going on. Most offered sympathetic words, but Marcus could sense the tension in the air. Some of them glanced at him with a mixture of pity and discomfort, while others avoided looking at him altogether. The once familiar faces now felt distant, as if they were unsure where they stood. When the police arrived, they took down the details and offered to patrol the area more frequently. But one of the officers gave Marcus a subtle warning. "You might want to be careful, son," the officer said, his tone stern but not unkind. "These people, they may not take kindly to you staying here if they feel threatened." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "I don't understand," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "All I did was help." The officer sighed. "Sometimes doing the right thing brings out the worst in people. Just watch your back, okay?" As the police left, Marcus felt a hollow ache in his chest. He was stuck between staying true to himself and keeping his head down to avoid further trouble. But he knew he couldn't keep living like this. He wouldn't let fear force him to run away from the place he called home. The next few days passed quietly, but Marcus could sense an underlying tension wherever he went. Some of his neighbors gave him friendly nods, but others avoided him altogether, as if he were a stranger. He began to realize just how deeply the couple's words had impacted the community. One evening, as he left the grocery store after his shift, he saw the woman standing near the entrance. Her gaze was cold as she watched him approach. Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach, but he kept walking, hoping to pass her without a confrontation. But as he walked by, she stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "I know what you're trying to do," she said in a low, biting voice. "You're trying to make yourself look good at our expense." Marcus stared at her, bewildered. "What are you talking about? I didn't ask for any of this. I just did what anyone would have done." "Anyone?" she scoffed, crossing her arms. "People around here look out for their own. You don't belong here, and you never will." Marcus's patience snapped. He had tried to keep his head down, to stay calm and avoid making things worse, but this was too much. "Your baby was in a burning building," he said, his voice firm. "And you're angry at me because I saved her? That's not looking out for your own. That's just hate." The woman's face reddened, and for a moment, she looked taken aback. But then her expression hardened again. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" she said through gritted teeth. "You think you can just waltz in here and act like a hero?" Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing there, his heart pounding with frustration and hurt. He watched her go, realizing that no amount of reasoning would change her mind. Some people's hearts were closed, and nothing he did would ever be enough for them. The weeks passed, and Marcus tried to move on. But the hostility continued, subtle yet unrelenting. He would find his things moved in the grocery store's break room, his belongings scattered. Sometimes he would come home to find his doormat missing or the lights outside his door unscrewed. It was clear that whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop. But one evening, as he was closing up the store, Marcus noticed someone waiting for him by the door. It was Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Peterson's husband, who had always been kind to him. Marcus was surprised. Mr. Peterson rarely came out this late. "Marcus," Mr. Peterson began, his face somber. "I've been meaning to talk to you." Marcus felt a pang of dread. "Is everything okay, Mr. Peterson?" Mr. Peterson nodded slowly, though he looked troubled. "I just wanted to say, don't let them push you out. People like that, they're afraid of change, of anything that challenges the way they see the world. But there are good people here too, Marcus. People who see what you did, who appreciate it." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. It means a lot to hear that." Mr. Peterson gave him a small smile. "You're a good man, Marcus, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As Marcus walked home that night, he felt a renewed sense of strength. He wasn't alone in this. There were people who saw him for who he was, who understood what he had done and appreciated his courage. And as long as he had that support, he would stand his ground. But the very next day, something happened that tested Marcus's resolve more than anything before. As he entered the grocery store for his shift, he was greeted by a tense silence. The store manager, Mr. Andrews, was waiting for him with a grave expression. "Marcus, can I speak with you in the office?" he asked, his tone uncharacteristically serious. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat as he followed Mr. Andrews to the back office. Once they were inside, Mr. Andrews closed the door and sighed heavily. "I don't know how to say this, Marcus," he began, looking troubled. "But we've had a complaint, a serious one, from the couple whose baby you saved." Marcus blinked in disbelief. "What? They're still upset about that?" Mr. Andrews nodded, looking uncomfortable. "They're claiming that you acted inappropriately during the rescue. They're saying you invaded their privacy, made them feel unsafe." Marcus's jaw dropped. "I was saving their baby from a fire. How could they twist it into something like that?" Mr. Andrews raised a hand, trying to calm him down. "I know, Marcus. I believe you, and so do most of us. But they're threatening to take legal action. They're saying they'll sue the store if we don't let you go." Marcus felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. "You're firing me." Mr. Andrews looked down, his face full of regret. "I don't want to, Marcus, but my hands are tied. They're making a lot of noise, stirring up trouble in the community. They've even been talking to other customers, saying all kinds of things about you." Marcus's mind spun. He had risked his life to save a child, and now he was losing his job over it. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had never imagined that doing the right thing could lead to something so painful. Mr. Andrews reached out, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Listen, Marcus, I know this is unfair. I'll do everything I can to help you find another job, and I'll give you the highest recommendation possible. You're a good man, and I hate that it's come to this." Marcus nodded numbly, his heart heavy with frustration and hurt. He thanked Mr. Andrews, though the words felt hollow, and gathered his things, leaving the store that had once felt like home. As he walked home, his mind whirled with anger and disbelief. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being punished, his life turned upside down because of one act of courage. And as he reached his apartment building, he noticed another message painted on his door, this time in larger letters. "Last warning, leave or else." Marcus took a step back, feeling a chill run down his spine. It was clear that whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until he was gone. But he knew in his heart that he couldn't let them win. The threat on Marcus's door, painted in harsh, jagged letters, left a sickening feeling in his stomach. He stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. He'd never been one to back down, but this was different. Whoever had done this wanted him to feel afraid, and the message was clear. They weren't going to stop until he was gone. Inside his apartment, Marcus paced back and forth, wondering what he should do next. His mother's words replayed in his mind. "You know who you are, Marcus. Let that be enough." But was that enough? He felt isolated, with the community he'd once felt a part of now turning against him, fueled by one hateful family's words. After a restless night, Marcus woke with a decision. He was going to fight this. He wasn't just going to let them push him out of his home or let these baseless threats take over his life. He would need help, though, and he knew just who to ask. Later that morning, he called Mrs. Peterson. The elderly woman had always been kind to him, and if anyone in the neighborhood could give him a sense of support, it would be her. He explained what had been happening, the job loss, the threats on his door, and the rumors that had spread around the neighborhood. "Oh, Marcus, I had no idea it had gotten this bad," she said, her voice filled with concern. "But you don't need to go through this alone. There are good people here who will stand with you. I'm calling a few folks, and we're going to put a stop to this nonsense." Her words filled Marcus with relief and gratitude. He wasn't alone after all. That same afternoon, Mrs. Peterson organized a small gathering at her house, inviting neighbors who supported Marcus and wanted to see this intimidation stop. They arrived one by one, filling Mrs. Peterson's living room and spilling into the kitchen, their faces full of determination. Once everyone was gathered, Mrs. Peterson stood up, her voice firm and strong despite her age. "What's happening here is wrong," she began. "Marcus saved the baby's life, and this is the thanks he gets. We are better than this. We are a community, and that means we stand by those who help, not tear them down." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd, and several people nodded, glancing at Marcus with warm, supportive smiles. "Marcus," said a middle-aged man from across the room, "if there's anything we can do, just tell us. We've heard the rumors, and we're not buying any of it. You did what you thought was right." Touched by their kindness, Marcus shared his plan. "I'm going to file a report with the police. I'll try to ignore it, to let it go, but it's clear they're not going to stop. I can't do this alone, though. I need witnesses, people who will speak out with me." One by one, the neighbors raised their hands, pledging to stand with him. Mrs. Peterson patted his shoulder, her eyes shining with pride. "We're with you, Marcus. Let them see that this community won't be divided by hate." The next day, Marcus filed a formal complaint with the police. With the support of his neighbors and the police's increasing awareness of the situation, he hoped it would be enough to discourage any further threats. The officers took his report seriously this time, promising to look into the vandalism and to interview those involved in the escalating tension. Word quickly spread that Marcus had reported the harassment. The couple that had started the rumors were not pleased. The mother, visibly irritated, confronted Marcus outside his apartment building. "Thought you could go running to the police, didn't you?" she sneered. "You don't belong here. People are on our side, you know. They're not going to take your side over ours." Marcus stood his ground, meeting her gaze. "There are people in this community who see the truth. You might be able to intimidate me, but you won't break me. I'm not going anywhere." She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "We'll see how long that lasts," she spat, before turning and walking away. Marcus felt the adrenaline in his veins, his resolve only growing stronger. This time, he knew he wasn't fighting alone. Days turned into weeks, and though the hateful messages stopped, the tension remained. Marcus kept to himself, trying to go about his life, but he could feel the weight of every stare, every whisper that followed him as he walked through the neighborhood. Then, one evening, just as he was settling down in his apartment, his phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Peterson. She had been keeping an eye on things, staying in touch with people around the neighborhood, and now she had some troubling news. "Marcus, I think you should know, the couple is planning something. They're gathering a few people at their house tomorrow night, saying they'll make him pay. I don't know what they mean, but I don't like it." Marcus's heart sank. He had hoped that things would eventually die down, that the police report and the support from his neighbors would put an end to this. But it seemed that the couple was still determined to get rid of him, no matter the cost. As he read the message, a new feeling crept over him. Not fear, but a fierce determination. He would not run. Not now. He had saved a life, and he had the support of good people. No matter what they tried, he wasn't going anywhere. Tomorrow night, he would be ready. The next day, Marcus spent most of his time preparing. He kept in close contact with Mrs. Peterson, who promised to gather a few supportive neighbors to stay nearby in case anything went wrong. The police were also notified, and they agreed to have a patrol car swing by his apartment more frequently that night. Marcus knew he'd have to be cautious, but he felt reassured by the support around him. As the sun began to set, he waited in his apartment, heart pounding as he kept an ear out for any unusual sounds. The neighborhood was strangely quiet, as if the whole area was holding its breath. Hours passed, and just as Marcus began to wonder if the couple would follow through with their threat, he heard a shuffling noise outside his door. He moved to the peephole, peering out to see two shadows lingering by his door. He couldn't make out their faces, but he recognized the tense, hurried whispers as they attempted to do something to his door. His stomach clenched when he noticed one of them pull out a small container, likely holding paint or another substance to deface his door again. But this time, Marcus was prepared. He took a deep breath, opened the door abruptly, and stood face to face with the couple. They both jumped back, caught off guard, but their shock quickly turned into anger. "What are you doing here, Marcus?" the woman snapped, trying to sound bold but looking shaken. "I should be asking you that," Marcus replied firmly, his voice steady. "I've done nothing but try to live my life peacefully, yet here you are, trying to intimidate me again." The man's face twisted with contempt. "You don't belong here. You've stirred up enough trouble. This neighborhood doesn't need someone like you." Marcus held his ground. "I saved your baby's life, and this is the thanks I get. Harassment, vandalism, threats. I'm not going to let you chase me out." The woman's face flushed with anger. "You think you're so noble, don't you?" she spat. "Like you're some kind of hero, but nobody asked you to play the hero. You're just trying to make yourself look better than everyone else here." Marcus felt his patience slipping, but he kept his voice calm. "All I did was help. And now, because of that, I've lost my job, I've been threatened, and you're trying to ruin my life. I'm done staying silent." Just then, Mrs. Peterson and a small group of neighbors appeared at the end of the hall, having heard the commotion. She walked over, her voice strong and unwavering. "Enough is enough," she declared, pointing at the couple. "Marcus has every right to be here, and we're not going to let you bully him anymore. Your daughter wouldn't be alive today if it weren't for him, and this is how you treat him." The couple looked taken aback, glancing around as more neighbors stepped forward, murmuring their support for Marcus. The man's face twisted with embarrassment, but he kept his ground, muttering under his breath. "We don't have to put up with this," he grumbled. "Let's go." The woman glared at Marcus one last time before turning away with her husband, disappearing down the hallway without another word. As they walked away, Marcus felt a huge weight lift off his shoulders. He looked around at his neighbors, their supportive smiles reminding him that he wasn't alone in this. Mrs. Peterson gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "They won't be bothering you anymore," she said with a small smile, "and if they do, we'll be right here to stop them." Marcus thanked everyone, deeply touched by their support. The events of the night had been unsettling, but knowing he had friends standing by his side made him feel stronger than ever. The next day, Marcus tried to return to normal, hoping the worst was finally behind him. But as he was cleaning up around his apartment, he noticed an envelope slip under his door. Curious, he opened it and unfolded the note inside. The message was chilling. "You may have won this round, but only comfortable. We're not done with you." Marcus's heart raced as he read the words. It was clear that the couple wasn't backing down, even after facing the community's support for him. This wasn't over, and he knew he'd have to stay vigilant. He took a deep breath, crumpling the note in his hand. If they wanted to keep this fight going, he would be ready. Marcus sat on his couch, the crumpled note still in his hand. His mind buzzed with thoughts, each one more unsettling than the last. The support from his neighbors had been a relief, but this threat meant his troubles were far from over. He decided he couldn't face this alone anymore. It was time to take further action. Later that evening, Marcus made his way to the police station with the note in hand. He explained to the officer at the desk everything that had happened, the threats, the harassment, and now this latest warning. The officer took notes, nodding seriously as Marcus shared his story. "We'll open a case and keep an eye on things," the officer promised, tucking the note into a plastic evidence bag. "If they've threatened you in writing, we can start investigating more directly. This kind of harassment won't be tolerated." Marcus left the station feeling slightly better, but as he walked home, the anxiety crept back in. He knew that without proof of who had written the note, there was only so much the police could do. Still, he reminded himself that he was taking the right steps. For now, he just had to stay alert. The following week was surprisingly peaceful. Marcus kept to his daily routines, staying connected with his supportive neighbors, and going for walks around the neighborhood to remind himself that he belonged there as much as anyone. He felt a growing sense of resilience with each passing day, refusing to let the couple's actions define his life. Then one evening, as Marcus was walking back from the grocery store, he spotted the couple standing by their car in the parking lot. They were deep in conversation, shooting him occasional glances. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine but decided not to acknowledge them. He held his head high, walking past them as if they were invisible. But as he passed, he overheard a snippet of their conversation. A way to make him feel like he's not welcome anymore. Marcus's stomach twisted. He tried to keep walking, pretending not to have heard anything. But the weight of their words lingered in his mind, gnawing at his sense of safety. As he turned the corner to his apartment building, he almost bumped into Mrs. Peterson, who was out walking her small dog. She looked up at him, her expression brightening. "Marcus, how are you holding up?" she asked, patting his arm reassuringly. Marcus managed a small smile. "Better, thanks to you and the others. But they're still watching me," he said, his voice dropping. "I overheard them talking about how they want to keep making me feel like I don't belong." Mrs. Peterson's face hardened. "That's not going to happen. You're not alone in this, Marcus." As they spoke, another neighbor, a young woman named Carla, approached. She'd been one of the first to speak up for Marcus at the neighborhood gathering. "Hey, Marcus, Mrs. Peterson," she greeted them. "We were just talking about setting up a neighborhood watch. We want you to feel safe here." Marcus felt a warm surge of gratitude. It was incredible to see people rally around him like this, and he realized just how much strength he'd drawn from his neighbors' support. The fear and uncertainty didn't disappear, but knowing he had allies made it easier to bear. But just as Marcus was beginning to feel a sense of security, an extreme event would strike, testing his strength once more. One night, just as Marcus was about to go to bed, his phone buzzed with a series of urgent messages. He squinted at the screen, his heart sinking as he read Carla's message. "Marcus, I think you should see this." Attached was a picture of his car, parked outside his building. His jaw dropped as he took in the sight. Someone had spray-painted a hateful slur across the side of the vehicle, bold and ugly for everyone to see. His mind reeled with shock, anger, and sadness. Before he could fully process the image, another message from Carla appeared. "We're here for you, Marcus. They won't get away with this." Marcus rushed downstairs to find Carla and a few other neighbors already standing by his car, talking among themselves, their faces filled with anger and empathy. One of the neighbors, a retired mechanic, stepped forward. "I can help clean this up for you," he offered, his voice kind but firm. "You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." The small crowd around Marcus made him feel safe, even as the hateful message on his car reminded him of the prejudice he was facing. His neighbors' support gave him a sliver of hope, but the night's events were a stark reminder of how determined his harassers were. Then Mrs. Peterson spoke up, her voice steely. "This is a crime, plain and simple. We're going to call the police, and we're not backing down until this is handled." Marcus nodded, his voice shaky. "I appreciate it, more than you know." As the night went on, he stayed outside with his neighbors, all of them standing in quiet solidarity until the police arrived. The officers took photos, collected statements, and assured Marcus they would investigate the incident as a hate crime. With the police now deeply involved, Marcus hoped that justice might finally come, but he knew the battle was far from over. The next morning, Marcus woke to a message from Mrs. Peterson, letting him know that a community meeting was being organized at her house that evening. Word of the hateful graffiti had spread through the neighborhood, and more people were ready to stand with Marcus. He spent the day trying to focus on normal things, but his mind kept wandering back to his car, now marred with that slur, and the couple who had stirred up so much hatred against him. He felt a mixture of frustration and resilience. It was as if every hateful act only made him more determined to stay. By evening, Marcus made his way to Mrs. Peterson's house. As he walked in, he was surprised to see the room packed with people. Neighbors he barely knew and some he'd never spoken to were there, sitting shoulder to shoulder, their faces serious. Carla waved him over, and he took a seat beside her, nodding at the others who greeted him with encouraging smiles. Mrs. Peterson stood at the front of the room, her gaze sweeping over the group. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "What happened to Marcus's car was unacceptable. And it's clear that this is more than just a misunderstanding. This is harassment, plain and simple, and it has no place in our community." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Carla raised her hand and spoke up, her voice firm. "We've all seen what's happening here. Marcus saved a child's life. How can anyone twist that into something bad? We need to make sure he knows he's welcome here, and that this kind of behavior isn't tolerated." The retired mechanic who had helped Marcus with his car nodded. "I think we need a neighborhood petition. Something to show that the majority of us support Marcus and don't stand for what's been happening." Mrs. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "A petition is a good idea, but I also think we need to take it a step further. We need to contact the housing association and make sure they're aware of what's going on. If this couple keeps spreading lies and harassing Marcus, they need to be held accountable." As people shared ideas and discussed plans, Marcus felt his chest swell with gratitude. The gathering felt more like a team coming together, a group determined to see justice served. Later that night, after everyone had left Mrs. Peterson's, Marcus and Carla stayed behind to help clean up. As they stacked chairs and gathered cups, Carla looked over at him. "Are you okay, Marcus?" she asked gently. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "I'm better than I was. Knowing I have people like you and Mrs. Peterson on my side, it means more than I can say." Carla smiled softly. "We're here for you, Marcus. Don't forget that." Just as they were about to leave, Mrs. Peterson came over, holding a file in her hands. "Marcus, I thought you might want to see this." Curious, Marcus took the file and opened it. Inside was a collection of documents Mrs. Peterson had put together, evidence of the couple's escalating actions, pictures, emails from neighbors recounting incidents, and a record of the threats he had reported to the police. It was a solid case file, something he could present to the housing association or even to legal authorities if things got worse. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson," Marcus said, feeling a lump form in his throat. "This is exactly what I needed." "Don't let them push you out, Marcus. We're not going to let them win." The next few days went by with an eerie calm. Marcus kept a close eye on his surroundings, and neighbors continued to check in on him. strengthening the sense of solidarity that had grown since the incident. The petition was underway, and a housing association had agreed to meet with Marcus and a few other residents to address the harassment issue. But just as Marcus began to feel hopeful, another extreme event would shake him to his core. One evening, as he returned home from a walk, he noticed a strange glow coming from the parking lot. At first, he thought someone had left their headlights on, but as he got closer, he realized with horror that it wasn't headlights. It was flames. His car was on fire, the orange flames crackling and licking up toward the darkening sky. Marcus's heart pounded as he took in the scene, the heat from the flames hitting his face as he rushed toward it. A few neighbors had already gathered, and someone was calling the fire department. Marcus. Carla's voice rang out as she ran over to him, her face filled with shock and fear. "Are you okay?" Marcus nodded, though he felt numb with disbelief. It was one thing to spray paint his car. It was another to set it on fire. This was no longer just harassment. This was a blatant threat, one meant to make him feel unsafe in the most direct way possible. The fire department arrived within minutes, dousing the flames and securing the area. As the last embers died down, a police officer approached Marcus, his expression serious. "Mr. Hill, I'm sorry you're going through this," the officer said. "We're going to investigate this as arson. Do you have any idea who might be responsible?" Marcus clenched his fists, a deep frustration bubbling up inside him. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "Yes, officer. I have a pretty good idea." The officer nodded, scribbling down notes. "We'll look into it, and we'll get in touch." As Marcus watched his burned car smolder, a new resolve formed within him. He was done hiding, done feeling like he didn't belong. He was going to fight back, and this time, he wasn't just defending himself. He was standing up for his right to exist peacefully in his own community. The next day, armed with the case file Mrs. Peterson had put together and the support of his neighbors, Marcus decided it was time to take his stand. He would meet with the housing association, press charges, and do whatever it took to stop the harassment. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Marcus was more determined than ever to see justice served. The following day, Marcus gathered his evidence: Mrs. Peterson's detailed file, the signed petition, photos of his vandalized car, and the latest police report documenting the arson. With each piece of evidence in his hands, he felt a surge of determination. This would be the day he faced the housing association and demanded they take action. He arrived at the housing association's office, where a few of his supportive neighbors were already waiting for him. Carlett and Mrs. Peterson gave him reassuring smiles, and a few other neighbors who had signed the petition nodded in encouragement. The meeting was held in a small conference room, and as Marcus entered, he saw the members of the housing association seated around the table, along with the couple who had been harassing him. The couple looked smug, as if they hadn't done anything wrong. But Marcus knew this time he wasn't alone. He had his neighbors standing with him, and he had solid evidence. The head of the housing association, a middle-aged woman named Ms. Lopez, cleared her throat. "Thank you all for being here. We've received a serious complaint from Mr. Hill regarding harassment and threats he's experienced over the past few weeks. Mr. Hill, would you like to begin by explaining your side of the story?" Marcus took a deep breath and stood. He recounted everything from the start: how he had saved the couple's baby from the burning building, only to face growing animosity from them afterward. He described the vandalism, the threats, the arson on his car, and he presented each piece of evidence one by one. He showed them the hateful slur sprayed on his car, the crumpled note with the ominous threat, and the police reports detailing each incident. The housing association members listened in silence, some of their faces showing shock as Marcus laid out the relentless harassment he'd endured. When Marcus finished, Ms. Lopez turned to the couple. "Do you have anything to say in response to these accusations?" The woman scoffed, folding her arms defiantly. "This is ridiculous. We've done nothing to him. He's the one causing trouble, acting like he's some hero around here." Her husband chimed in, "Yeah, he's just trying to make us look bad. This whole neighborhood was fine until he came along, stirring things up." Marcus felt a flash of anger but held his tongue, letting Ms. Lopes handle it. She looked back and forth between Marcus and the couple, her expression growing increasingly firm. "Whether or not you agree with Mr. Hill's actions, the evidence he's provided is troubling, to say the least. Vandalism, threats, and now arson. These are criminal acts. We have multiple accounts from neighbors corroborating Mr. Hill's claims." She paused, her gaze hardening as she addressed the couple. "If you have nothing more to add, I think we'll proceed with the vote." Ms. Lopez turned to the housing association members. Given the evidence, I propose that we issue an official warning to Mr. and Mrs. Bradford and take steps to prevent further incidents, including possible eviction if these actions continue. All in favor? Every hand in the room went up except for the couples. Mrs. Bradford's face flushed with anger, but her husband looked stunned, clearly realizing how serious things had become. Ms. Lopez turned to Marcus. Mr. Hill, we'll be following up with local authorities to support their investigation. You have our assurance that this harassment will not continue, and we'll do everything in our power to ensure your safety here. Marcus nodded, relief washing over him. He thanked her and the association members, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. It was the first time he truly felt like justice was on his side. That evening, Marcus returned home with his neighbors, who had come to celebrate the small victory. As they gathered in his apartment, sharing stories and laughter, Marcus realized just how much he had gained through this ordeal. He had not only defended his right to live in peace, but had also gained a community willing to stand by him. As they raised a toast to resilience and friendship, a knock sounded at the door. Marcus froze for a moment, but Carla quickly placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He opened the door to find 2 police officers standing there. "Mr. Hill," one officer said, "we're here to update you on the investigation. After today's meeting with the Housing Association, we had a chance to review the evidence and speak with a few witnesses. We've determined there's enough cause to file charges against Mr. and Mrs. Bradford for harassment, vandalism, and arson." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected action so quickly, but he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. "Thank you, officers," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The officer nodded. "You've shown a lot of courage, Mr. Hill. We'll keep you informed as the case progresses." As the officers left, the room erupted in cheers. For the first time, Marcus felt the tension of the past few weeks melt away, replaced by hope and a deep gratitude for the people around him. The days that followed were calm, and the Bradfords eventually moved out of the neighborhood, unable to face the consequences of their actions. Marcus remained in his apartment, his home now filled with warmth, laughter, and a community that supported him. He knew there might still be challenges ahead, but he also knew he had the strength and the friends to face them. And as he looked out his window, watching his neighbors go about their lives, he felt at peace, knowing he had claimed his place, free from fear. As the weeks passed, life in the neighborhood settled into a comforting routine. The incident with the Bradfords faded into a distant memory, replaced by laughter and camaraderie. Marcus felt grateful for the support he received from his neighbors, who had become his friends and allies. He was determined to make his community a welcoming place for everyone, especially after everything he had endured. One sunny Saturday morning, Mrs. Peterson called for a community barbecue in the local park to celebrate the neighborhood's resilience and unity. Marcus was excited. It was a chance for everyone to gather, share food, and strengthen the bonds that had formed during the recent struggles. On the day of the barbecue, the park was bustling with activity. Families set up picnic tables, children played games, and the aroma of grilled burgers wafted through the air. Marcus arrived early, helping to set up with Carla and a few other neighbors. They laughed and joked as they worked, grateful for the chance to relax and enjoy each other's company. Mrs. Peterson was flipping burgers at the grill, chatting with another neighbor while keeping an eye on the kids playing nearby. She waved over to Marcus as he approached. "Marcus, come help me with these," she called, handing him a plate of freshly grilled burgers. As the afternoon rolled on, the atmosphere buzzed with laughter and chatter. Marcus looked around, taking in the sight of his neighbors enjoying themselves. It felt like a celebration of their unity and resilience, a testament to what they had overcome together. "Hey, Marcus," Carla called out, waving him over. "We got a surprise for you." Curious, Marcus followed her to the center of the park where a small stage had been set up. The community had organized a small talent show, showcasing the various talents of its residents. As he approached, he saw Mrs. Peterson speaking to the crowd. "Thank you all for coming today. We're here to celebrate our wonderful neighborhood and the amazing people in it," she announced, beaming. "But before we start the talent show, we have something special to share." The crowd hushed, and Marcus felt his heart race as Carla nudged him forward. "You should go up there," she encouraged him softly. "What? No way," Marcus replied, feeling bashful. Mrs. Peterson spotted him and smiled widely. "Marcus, we'd like you to come up here and say a few words. You've shown us what it means to be brave and how important it is to support one another." Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. The community had rallied around him, and now he had the opportunity to express his gratitude. He stepped up to the microphone, the warm sun shining down on him. "Thank you, everyone," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in his stomach. "I can't tell you how much your support has meant to me. When I first moved here, I didn't know what to expect, but you all welcomed me like family." He glanced at Carla and Mrs. Peterson, who were beaming with pride. "The past few months have been tough, but I've learned that community is everything. We have to look out for one another and stand up against hate and injustice. Together we can create a place where everyone feels safe and welcome." The crowd erupted into applause, and Marcus felt a swell of emotion. He realized how far he had come, from feeling like an outsider to being embraced by this loving community. After his speech, the talent show kicked off, filled with songs, dances, and even a few comedy skits. Everyone laughed and cheered, enjoying the showcase of creativity and talent. Marcus joined in, cheering on his neighbors and reveling in the joy of the moment. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the park, Marcus felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. This was more than just a neighborhood. It was a community that stood together against adversity. However, just when he thought the day couldn't get any better, an unexpected guest arrived, his old friend and mentor from his college days, Jason. Marcus spotted him from across the park, his tall figure waving enthusiastically. "Marcus, I couldn't believe it when I heard you were in town. I had to come see you," Jason exclaimed as he reached Marcus, pulling him into a bear hug. Marcus grinned, feeling a rush of nostalgia. "It's great to see you, man. What brings you here?" Jason glanced around at the festivities, a smile spreading across his face. "I heard you've been doing some amazing work in the community. I'm really proud of you." They chatted for a while, catching up on old times and sharing stories about their lives. Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose as he recounted his experiences with the Bradfords and how his community had rallied to support him. As the evening wound down and the last of the talent performances concluded, Mrs. Peterson called everyone's attention once more. "Before we finish tonight, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Let's remember to continue supporting one another and to keep this community strong." Everyone clapped, and Marcus felt a sense of pride swell within him. He realized that despite the darkness he had faced, he had emerged stronger, supported by the bonds he had built with his neighbors. As people began to pack up, Marcus found a moment alone with Jason. "You know, I've been thinking about starting a community outreach program. Something to help connect people, especially after everything that's happened. What do you think?" Jason nodded enthusiastically. "That sounds like a fantastic idea. You have a way of bringing people together, Marcus. I'd love to help you with it." Marcus felt a spark of excitement. It was time to channel his experiences into something positive, something that would ensure that no one in their community ever felt isolated or unwelcome again. He and Jason exchanged ideas, brainstorming ways to implement workshops, support groups, and fund community events that would foster understanding and togetherness. As the last of the barbecue supplies were packed away and the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus felt a sense of hope blossoming within him. He had come a long way, and now, with the support of his friends, he was ready to embark on a new journey. This was just the beginning of something great, something that would make a difference not only for him, but for everyone in his community. Just then, as he turned to head home, a sudden flicker of movement caught his eye. He looked up to see a shadowy figure watching him from a distance, a feeling of dread washing over him. Could it be someone from his past? Was there still a threat lurking in the shadows, waiting to undo all the progress he had made? The unsettling feeling sent a chill down his spine. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the fear. "Focus on the good," he whispered to himself. But the nagging doubt lingered as he made his way home, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, he wasn't alone anymore. With his community by his side, he was ready to fight back against any negativity that threatened to overshadow their newfound unity. As the weeks turned into months, the sense of community Marcus had helped cultivate continued to flourish. The outreach program he and Jason had initiated became a beacon of hope for many. They organized workshops focusing on diversity, inclusion, and conflict resolution, inviting speakers from different backgrounds to share their stories. The program became so popular that the local news featured it, shining a light on the positive change taking place in their neighborhood. However, the shadowy figure Marcus had seen that evening lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Bradfords, though gone, might still be plotting some form of retaliation. Despite the progress he was making, he kept his guard up. One evening, as he prepared for another outreach meeting, he received a call from the police. The officer informed him that the investigation into the Bradfords had progressed, and they were being charged with multiple offenses, including harassment and arson. The authorities had gathered enough evidence from the reports, testimonies from neighbors, and surveillance footage from the area. They'll be facing serious consequences, Marcus, the officer said. We're going to ensure that they're held accountable for their actions. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was a significant step toward justice, not just for himself, but for the community that had suffered in silence. He shared the news with his neighbors, who celebrated the breakthrough together, reinforcing the bonds they had built during their shared struggles. One day, while preparing for a neighborhood potluck, Marcus received a message from Mrs. Peterson. Marcus, I think you should come to the community center tonight. We need you to help us with something important. Curious, Marcus arrived at the community center to find a gathering of neighbors. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Mrs. Peterson stood at the front, her expression serious yet hopeful. Everyone, as you know, we've faced challenges together, she began, and we come up stronger. We want to show our appreciation for Marcus, who not only stood up for himself, but for all of us. Without his bravery, we might still be living in fear. So we decided to present him with a community award for courage and leadership. The room erupted in applause as Mrs. Peterson handed Marcus a beautifully crafted plaque. It read, in recognition of courage and community leadership. He was overwhelmed with emotion, realizing just how much his actions had resonated with those around him. Thank you, everyone. This means more to me than you can imagine, Marcus said, his voice thick with gratitude. But I couldn't have done it without all of you. This award belongs to each of us. Together, we are stronger. The community rallied behind him, their support reinforcing the foundation they had built together. As the months continued, the Bradfords faced the consequences of their actions. They were brought to trial for their harassment and vandalism, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. Their actions had not only harmed Marcus, but had threatened the fabric of the community. As the trial unfolded, testimonies from neighbors painted a vivid picture of their hostility. The judge was stern, emphasizing the impact their behavior had on the neighborhood. Your actions have caused fear and division among a community that should be united. You will face the consequence of your choices. The Bradfords received a hefty fine and were sentenced to community service, working alongside Marcus's outreach program to promote healing and understanding. Marcus felt a mix of emotions watching them face their consequences. He believed in redemption, and while their punishment was warranted, he hoped that through the community service, they might learn to change their hearts and minds. Meanwhile, the outreach program flourished. It became a model for other neighborhoods, inspiring similar initiatives across the city. The community center was always buzzing with activities, support groups, cultural exchanges, and events that fostered connection among people from all walks of life. Marcus found himself in a leadership role, guiding discussions and promoting a sense of belonging. He was proud to see how the community transformed, becoming a place where everyone felt valued. One evening, as he wrapped up a meeting, Jason approached him with a grin. You know, I think it's time we plan a neighborhood festival, a celebration of everything we've accomplished together. That sounds amazing, Marcus replied, his eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. A festival would be a great way to showcase our unity. The festival planning began, and the community came together once again, brainstorming ideas, organizing games, and inviting local artists and performers. The big day arrived, and the park transformed into a vibrant celebration of diversity and resilience. Families gathered, laughter filled the air, and the sound of music brought people together. There were booths showcasing local cuisines, crafts from different cultures, and games for children. The festival was a joyful reminder of the journey they had all taken together. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the park, Marcus took a moment to step back and take it all in. He saw the smiles on people's faces and felt a warmth in his heart. The festival concluded with a speech from Marcus, who stood at the center stage once again. Today we celebrate our community and everything we've accomplished. We faced challenges, but together we built something beautiful. Let's continue to support each other, promote love, and ensure that our neighborhood is a place where everyone feels safe and welcome. As the crowd erupted in cheers, Marcus felt a sense of fulfillment. He had turned a moment of fear into a powerful force for good, and the community was thriving. In the following weeks, the neighborhood continued to flourish. The Bradfords, although still facing the consequences of their actions, participated in the outreach program, slowly learning the importance of understanding and acceptance. They began to connect with others in the community, their hearts slowly changing. As for Marcus, he had not only found his place within the community, but had become a leader and a source of inspiration for many. He had transformed his painful experiences into a catalyst for change, proving that one person's courage can make a significant difference. The sun rose on a new day in the neighborhood, shining brightly on a community united in love, resilience, and hope. Marcus smiled as he walked through the park, knowing that he had helped create a safe space for everyone. And with that, he felt at peace, ready to face whatever came next, knowing he would never be alone again.